She knelt in the dark with her hands buried in cold, living mud, and the whole town of Jericho Flats agreed she had lost her mind. They said it over fence posts and at the dry goods counter, a murmur of pity that had curdled into scorn. Elspeth Thane, the widow. Out there on that bone-dry patch Thomas left her, digging in the dirt after sundown like a ghoul. They saw her lamp, a lone firefly bobbing against the black shoulder of the useless hill her husband had bought with the last of their savings, and they shook their heads. Nothing grew there but scrub and disappointment. Silas Croft, the land agent, had called it a charity case when he offered her $50 for the deed, a kindness he called it, to get her off that rock pile and into town where she could do mending. She had looked at his soft hands and said no. That was when the pity stopped and the mockery began. What they did not know, what they could not see from their porches, was that her hands were not in dust. They were in the silty, fragrant bed of a secret, and she was tending the one green thing in 100 parched miles. It was a promise whispered in the dark, a fortune that grew from stone and water, and she kept it guarded like a banked coal, waiting for the right kind of wind to bring it to a glow. 6 months earlier, the world had been all dust. The dust of the road that brought the news of Thomas's logging accident, the dust that settled on the unused wedding china, the dust that blew in through the cracks in the cabin walls. The land itself was a monument to dryness, 10 acres of cracked clay and sun-bleached rock that sloped up to a crumbling stone wall choked with thornapple. Thomas had seen a future in it. He'd talked of a deep well, of hauling water until the ground softened, of an orchard that would one day shade their children. Elspeth had tried to see it too, but now, alone, all she saw was the town's verdict written in the cracked soil. Fane's Folly, they'd called it when he was alive. Now it was just the widow's patch. Her only companion was Barrow, Thomas's old sheepdog, a creature of graying muzzle and arthritic gait whose loyalty was the one thing in her life that had not turned to dust. He was a quiet shadow at her heel, a warm weight against her feet in the cold nights. He was the last living piece of her husband, and she loved him with a fierce, protective ache. By June, a rhythm had settled over her grief. She would rise before the sun, mend clothes for the blacksmith's wife to earn flour and salt, and spend the rest of the day in a futile war against the land, clearing rocks from a patch of ground that was hard as iron. Barrow would lie in the sliver of shade cast by the cabin, watching her with his patient, amber eyes. Then, one afternoon, he was gone. Panic, sharp and cold, seized her. She called his name until her throat was raw, her voice swallowed by the vast, indifferent sky. She walked the property line, her eyes scanning the shimmering heat for a flicker of gray fur. Nothing. Just as despair began to set in, he trotted into view, appearing as if from nowhere near the overgrown stone wall at the top of the rise. His paws were damp and his muzzle was slick with black mud. He smelled of cool, wet earth. The next day, he vanished again. And again, he returned from the direction of the wall, muddy in content. It was a mystery in a life that had become brutally simple. There was no mud on her land. The creek at the bottom of the valley had dwindled to a thread of damp sand weeks ago. She had to haul her own water from the town well, 2 miles each way. Mud was a miracle. On the third day, she followed him. She stayed back, her steps light, watching as the old dog limped purposefully up the slope. He didn't slow at the wall but pushed directly into a thick, thorny tangle of brambles that seemed impassable. He wriggled his way through and disappeared completely. Elspeth hesitated, then pulled on her thick work gloves and began to tear at the thorns. They ripped at her sleeves and stung her arms, but she pushed deeper, following the faint tunnel the dog had made. Behind the curtain of thorns, the world changed. The air grew cool and heavy with the scent of stone and damp. The crumbling wall was thicker here, less a fence and more the remnant of a foundation. A section of it had collapsed inward, revealing a dark opening no bigger than a barrel. From within came the distinct, happy panting of the old dog. Elspeth got on her hands and knees, peering into the blackness. A draft of chill air, smelling of deep earth and something green and sharp, breathed over her face. Barrow whined softly, encouragingly. Taking a breath, she hitched up her skirts and crawled into the opening. She slid down a short, steep slope of loose earth and stone and landed on a floor of packed dirt. For a moment she was blind, enveloped in a profound and silent dark. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she saw it. A thread of silver, catching some faint light from the opening above. It was a trickle of water, impossibly, miraculously, seeping from a fissure in the rock wall. It pooled in a shallow, stone-lined basin before sliding into a channel carved into the floor and vanishing into another crack in the earth. The whole space was no larger than her small cabin, a stone-walled room half buried in the hillside, a spring house, forgotten by time. And in the basin, growing thick and lush in the cold, clear water, was a carpet of the most vibrant green she had ever seen. Barrow was lapping delicately at the water's edge. Elspeth crept forward and touched a leaf. It was cool and firm. She had never seen a plant like it. She sat back on her heels in the darkness, the dog's warm presence beside her, and listened to the sound the land had kept secret, the gentle, persistent whisper of water. It was the quietest sound in the world, and it was the loudest hope she had heard in a year. Being right is its own kind of reply, she thought, though she did not yet know how right she would be. She took a cutting, a small handful of the strange, peppery-smelling leaves wrapped in a damp cloth. She didn't go into town. Instead, she walked the 3 miles north to Anselm Hemlock's place. He was an old man from a country she couldn't pronounce, a place of mountains and deep forests, and he kept to himself, cultivating a garden that was a riot of strange herbs and gnarled vegetables. The town thought him odd, but Thomas had respected him. "He speaks the land's language," he'd said once. Anselm was sitting on his porch, carving a piece of willow wood into a bird. He looked up as she approached, his eyes the color of a faded sky. He did not smile, but the gaze was not unkind. She held out the damp bundle without a word. He took it, his gnarled fingers surprisingly gentle. He brought the leaves to his nose, crushing one between his thumb and forefinger. He sniffed it deeply, then touched it to his tongue. His eyes closed for a long moment. "Ah," he said, the sound a soft rumble in his chest. "Where the world sees a weed, a wise woman sees a pantry." He looked at her, his gaze sharp and knowing. "This is watercress. In the old country, we call it green fire. It grows only where the water is pure and cold and always moving. It is a sign of life. Deep down," he handed the cutting back to her. "This is a gift from the earth, child. Do not shout about it." His voice was soft, accented. "The best water whispers. It does not shout. You tend this. You clear the stones. You give it room. It will feed you when the shouting streams run dry." That was all he said, but it was enough. It was validation. It was a map. Elspeth walked home, the old man's words turning over in her mind. The best water whispers. Back at the spring house, she brought a lantern. The light chased the shadows into the corners, revealing the full extent of the place. It was old, built with a skill she recognized from the town's first church. The stones were dry-stacked, perfectly fitted. The channel was lined with flat slates. It was a work of care, abandoned for reasons she couldn't guess. Perhaps the family had moved on or died out, and the thorns had grown over, erasing the door from memory. Her first task was to clear the debris from the collapse. It was slow, heavy work. Day after day, she hauled out rocks and dirt in a bucket, her back and arms screaming with the effort. Finn, the blacksmith's son, a boy of 10 with watchful eyes and a silent tongue, saw her one afternoon. He'd been wandering the hills, as boys do, and simply appeared at the edge of the clearing she'd made. He didn't ask what she was doing. He just picked up a stone, smaller than the one she was heaving, and carried it to the pile she'd started. From then on, he often appeared after his chores were done. They worked in a comfortable silence, a woman wrestling with her inheritance and a boy finding purpose in the quiet labor. She paid him in mended shirts, and, once the work was done, small, savory pies she baked with her precious flour. Once the spring house was clear, she began the real work. Following Anselm's advice, she enlarged the growing beds, lining them with smooth stones from the pile outside. She thinned the wild patches of cress, giving the strongest plants room to breathe, and transplanted the smaller ones into the new beds. She learned the rhythm of the place. The water was coldest just before dawn. The cress grew fastest in the filtered twilight of the enclosed space. She began to think of the spring house not as a hole in the ground, but as a hidden room of her home, a secret pantry. The arithmetic of survival began to govern her days. 2 mended shirts for the blacksmith meant a sack of flour. A day's work clearing stones meant another square foot of growing space. She started counting the clusters of cress, estimating how many bunches she might harvest. It was a fragile equation of hope and hunger. She talked to the plants, a habit she'd picked up from her mother. She gave the beds names. The mother lode for the original patch, Thomas's hope for the first one she cleared, Finn's folly for the one the boy had laid out himself, its stones a little crooked. It was a gentle, private humor. The world outside remained harsh. When she went to town for supplies, the questions were sharp with pitying curiosity. Still trying to raise rocks up on that hill, Elspeth? The mercantile owner would ask. She would just nod, pay for her salt, and leave. She never offered a retort. She was banking her secret, keeping it safe from the dry winds of gossip and scorn. Let them think she was mad. Madness was a kind of fence. By the first week of July, the beds were thick and green, a rippling carpet of life in the cool, subterranean twilight. The peppery scent of the cress filled the air. It was time. She harvested before dawn, cutting the tender stems with a small knife, bundling them into bunches with twine, and packing them into 2 willow baskets lined with damp moss. She didn't take them to Jericho Flats. She hitched her old mule to the rickety buckboard Thomas had built and drove the 12 miles east to Prairie Ridge, a larger town where the railroad passed through. She felt like a thief, smuggling her treasure under a canvas tarp. She sold the cress not to the general store, but directly to the kitchen of the town's only hotel. The cook, a stout man with a suspicious squint, looked at the vibrant green bunches with disbelief. "Where'd you get this?" he demanded. "It's July. Everything's burnt to a crisp. It grows in a cool place," Elspeth said, her voice steady. He took a leaf, chewed it thoughtfully, and his eyes widened. The sharp, clean bite of it was the taste of spring in the heart of a punishing summer. He bought both baskets without another word, paying her in silver coins that felt heavy and real in her palm. It was more money than she had held at one time since Thomas's death. On the long ride home, she did the arithmetic again. 2 baskets a week, then 4, then maybe 6 if she built another bed. It was not a fortune, but it was solvency. It was independence. It was the whisper of water turning into the solid weight of coin. She made the trip to Prairie Ridge every Tuesday for a month, and her secret held. The hotel cook told no one his source. He called it his kitchen miracle, but miracles have a way of making themselves known. A traveling merchant from the city, staying at the hotel, was served a salad of such astonishing freshness that he demanded to know its origin. The cook was evasive, but the merchant was persistent. Finally, the cook relented, describing the quiet widow with the old mule who appeared every Tuesday with baskets of green fire. The following week, the merchant was waiting for her. He was a man named Abernathy, dressed in city clothes that looked out of place against the dusty backdrop of Prairie Ridge. He didn't haggle. He handled the cress like it was jewelry. "Madam," he said, his voice clipped and precise, "I can sell every bunch of this you can grow. In the city, chefs will weep for cress like this in this season. Name your price." Elspeth, who had been selling her bunches for 5 cents, found her voice. 10 cents, she said, the number feeling audacious and bold on her tongue. Abernathy smiled. "Done. I will send a wagon to Jericho Flats every Friday. Have 20 baskets ready." The number staggered her. 20 baskets. It was more than a living. It was a future. That Friday, a wagon bearing the name Abernathy Fine Provisions rolled into Jericho Flats and made its way up the dusty track to her cabin. It did not go unnoticed. The sight of a city provisioner leaving her worthless patch loaded with overflowing baskets of something impossibly green sent a ripple of confusion through the town. The mockery began to falter, replaced by a baffled curiosity. Elspeth didn't explain. She just worked, with Finn and Barrow as her silent partners, the rhythm of the harvest now a steady beat beneath the surface of her life. The whisper was getting louder. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The sky turned a hard, bleached white, and the sun beat down with a physical weight. The last of the town creek vanished, leaving a cracked, snakeskin pattern of dry mud. The corn in the fields turned brown and brittle before it could tassel. The pastures yellowed, then grayed. It was more than a dry spell. It was a drought, a slow, silent catastrophe that tightened its grip day by day. The mood in Jericho Flats grew grim. Conversations became clipped and anxious. The price of feed soared, and farmers began selling off their livestock for a fraction of their worth. Hunger, which had been a distant worry, became a quiet, constant presence at every table. Silas Croft, who owned the largest herd of cattle in the county, was hit the hardest. His vast pastures turned to dust bowls. He watched Elspeth's land with a new kind of attention. The pity was gone, replaced by a sharp, calculating envy. He saw the Abernathy wagon roll up her track every Friday and leave heavy. He saw that while his own fortune withered on the stalk, hers, impossibly, was green and growing. What he could not see was the source. He only knew that on the 10 acres everyone had dismissed as a wasteland, there was water. And in a drought, water was not just life, it was power. His condescension returned, but now it was a thin veneer over a raw greed. He found her one afternoon as she was repairing a fence line, his horse a stark black shape against the pale sky. "Elspeth," he began, his voice oozing a false warmth that made the hairs on her arms stand up. "A difficult season for everyone," she nodded, not looking at him, twisting the wire tight. "I've been thinking about your situation," he continued. "A young woman alone. This drought, it's a killer. I want to repeat my offer for this land. $100. Cash. Enough to see you settled comfortably in town before winter." It was double his first offer, but it was still an insult. She knew now what her land was worth. Or rather, she knew what it produced. The value wasn't in the acreage, but in the secret it held. "I'm not selling, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice even. His smile tightened. "Don't be foolish. You have a little kitchen garden, I hear. That's fine. But I have the means to develop this land properly. To sink a deep well, to access the water that's clearly here. It would be a service to the whole community." He was probing, trying to get her to reveal her source. She remained silent, coiling the leftover wire. His voice dropped, losing its pretense of warmth. "That water is a resource, Mrs. Thane. A community resource. It's not right for one person to hoard it while their neighbors suffer, one woman alone." The phrase echoed in her mind. It was meant to make her feel small and vulnerable. Instead, it made her feel the cold, hard certainty of her own strength. She had faced this land alone, discovered its heart alone, and made it thrive alone. She finally looked at him, her gaze direct. "The land is mine, Mr. Croft. The water is the land's. And what grows there is mine to sell at a fair price." His eyes narrowed. For a moment, the mask slipped entirely, and she saw the cold, predatory anger beneath. He wheeled his horse around without another word and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled slowly over her, a fine, gritty powder of impotent rage. The pressure from Croft was only the beginning. The drought tightened its fist around the valley. The town well began to run low, the water drawn up thick with silt. The faces on the street grew thinner, etched with worry. The baffled curiosity about Elspeth's sudden prosperity soured into a quiet, desperate resentment. Whispers followed her when she went to the mercantile. She was a hoarder. She had a secret well and kept it for herself. She was profiting from their misery. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. Elspeth felt the town's gaze on her back, cold and heavy. But she also saw the hollow look in the children's eyes, the slump in the men's shoulders. She knew the arithmetic of their lives, too. The cost of feed against the price of a calf. The yield of a withered acre against the needs of a family. One afternoon, Croft made his move. He arrived not alone, but with the town sheriff, a man whose loyalty was bought and paid for by Croft's influence. They stood on her porch, two grim-faced men blocking the sun. "Mrs. Thane," the sheriff said, avoiding her eyes. "Mr. Croft has filed a formal complaint. Under the territorial water use statutes, during a declared drought, all private water sources are subject to public survey and potential rationing for the common good." Croft smiled, a thin, triumphant slash. "It's just a formality, of course," he said smoothly. "We just need to assess the volume of your well to see how it can best serve the community." He was trying to force her hand, to make her reveal the spring house. He believed she had a well, a single point he could control. He didn't understand the nature of her secret. It wasn't a well to be commandeered. It was a living system she had nurtured. "There is no well, Mr. Croft," she said calmly. Croft's smile faltered. "Don't play games, Elspeth. We all see the Abernathy wagon. We see the green. You must be pulling 30, 40 baskets a week out of that patch of yours. And there it was. The slip. A cold stillness settled over Elspeth. She looked at him, her eyes unblinking. How did you know the count, Mr. Croft? The sheriff shifted his weight, suddenly uncomfortable. Croft's face flushed. It's common talk, he stammered, but the lie was plain. He had been watching her, spying, counting her baskets, measuring her success, planning how to take it from her. There is no well, she repeated, her voice as clear and cold as the water in her spring house. You are welcome to survey the property, Sheriff. You will find nothing but what you've always seen. Dust and rock. She held his gaze, a woman alone on her porch, armed with nothing but the truth. The sheriff looked from her to Croft, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He was a man of procedure, and she had just called the bluff. Defeated for the moment, they left. But Elspeth knew it was not over. Croft would not be satisfied until he owned the source of her prosperity, and he would use the town's desperation as his weapon. The town's suffering became her own. She heard it in the dry, hacking coughs of the children, saw it in the listless way the blacksmith, Finn's father, swung his hammer. His forge was often cold now. No one could afford to have tools mended or horses shod. One evening, there was a soft knock at her door. It was the blacksmith, his big hands twisting the brim of his hat. His face, usually ruddy from the forge's heat, was pale and strained. He was a proud man, a man who had been among the loudest of her mockers. It cost him everything to be standing on her porch. Mrs. Thane, he mumbled, his eyes fixed on his boots. The wife, the young uns, there's not much left, he swallowed hard. I know you sell that green stuff. To the city man. I was wondering. I don't have coin, but I could fix your buckboard. Or sharpen your tools. For a basket. Just 1 inch, it was the moment the drought had been leading to. This was the test. She held all the power. She had the one thing everyone needed. Fresh, living food. She could have charged him a fortune in labor.